Hello there, friends. Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations number 36. I'm your host, Joe Hannon, the battered grappler from New Jersey. We've had a rare couple of August days, the past 2 days in New Jersey. For those of you who have never had the pleasure of visiting the Garden State, Bruce Springsteen, the home of Bruce Springsteen, Bruce sings about the swamps of Jersey, and Rosalita, parentheses, come out tonight. And New Jersey in the summer is just one big swamp unless you're by the shore, enjoying the ocean. And we've had a couple days here of reprieve from the swampiness. It's been a breath of fresh air. Coming at you today during nap time. Usually I record these episodes on Friday and then release them on Monday morning, but had some competing demands on Friday. So right now it's Sunday afternoon. It's about 1 o'clock, and my son has been sleeping for about 15 minutes. So God willing, we'll get another hour and a half or so, and that'll give me enough time to record this sucker and do the production, and he'll never know it happened unless by some miracle he stumbles across this 10, 15 years from now, whatever. I often wonder about that. You know, I'm a fan of Your Mom's House with Tom Segura and Christina Pajitsky, and I just wonder, man, those kids, what are they going to think of their parents when they discover the archives of that podcast? Certainly, I've written enough stuff both about my son and about life in general to embarrass the shit out of him for the rest of his life. So one day he's going to find all this, and it's going to be an interesting conversation. Anyway, I thought I'd start out just by, and if I'm talking a bit more quietly than usual, I'm trying to get closer to the mic since I know my volume is down. It's because my son's room is right behind my office here, so trying not to wake him up while recording this. So hence the hushed tones, the Edward R. Murrow hushed tones that I'm delivering as opposed to my usual Sam Harris ethereal navel-gazing nonsense. Anyway, my camp for World Masters coming up. We're a little more than a week out at this point. I'm really tired. Had a really interesting training session yesterday. Usually Saturdays are one of my hardest training sessions of the week in terms of volume. The class I teach on Saturdays tends to be more of a mixed level class, and not a ton of black belts in the room, mostly like blue belts, white belts, some purple belts, some brown belts. So usually the open mat that follows is about an hour long, and I just try to stay moving the entire hour, consistently picking whoever the hardest person in the room is to train with. And yesterday I made it about a half hour in, and my body was just telling me no. So I listened to my body for a change. At this point in training camps in years prior, I've definitely kind of worn things down to metal on metal and gone in overtrained, sick, tired, and trying not to do that this time. I've had some really productive conversations with Emily Kwok, my coach, just about kind of putting back what the mats take out, and it's tough. And I'd be curious to know if any other Masters competitors are out there, how you balance this, because as Masters, most of us, unless you're Josh Hanger, who apparently is competing in Masters 3 black belt. Glad I'm not middleweight, and glad I'm not Masters 3. But for those of us who are Masters, you know, BJJ is not our career for the most part. It's something we do for, in my case, self-development and fitness and all the other myriad reasons that we talk about on this podcast. And many of us have careers and lives outside of jiu-jitsu, and it's just hard to balance all that. And that's really the point of friction that I feel normally in this point in any training camp, but especially in a master's training camp and a world's training camp, because this is a world championship event. And I feel like that deserves a certain quality level of training, a certain intensity level of training. And you're trying to meet both of those demands, and simultaneously life just keeps on pressing on you. You know, I try my best to be a good husband, a good father. I try my best to be an insightful professional creative and honor my commitments to my clients and deliver the quality and the excellence that they're accustomed to, and keep pushing myself in those creative domains. keep pushing myself in purely personal creative domains too, like in my jiu-jitsu, also in my writing. Like I just started working on what I hope will be another novel manuscript. Maybe we'll actually try to get this one published. Who knows? But it's just very hard to balance all these things. And it calls to mind something that Josh Wadeskin talks about frequently in our work together, this idea of balance through embracing imbalance. And I touched on this a little bit in the last meditation I did, where I talked about there being there's no point of enough. There is, and just as there's no point of enough, there is no point of balance either. It's like trying to stand on a paddleboard on the ocean. I had this experience, this hell experience in Costa Rica, the first time I was down there, where I was trying to learn how to paddleboard, and in the ocean, when you're on a lake or a bay or a nice flat body of water, it's much easier. But when you're on the ocean, you're constantly getting rocked by the waves. And if you try to look for a static point, if you try to hunker down, sort of bear down and stay in one spot, you're going to fall off every single time. Only do you achieve balance by embracing the imbalance, by embracing the undulation of the ocean, by softening your lower body and your upper body and kind of just moving with the water. For those of you who are watching, you kind of see me bobbing around like a bobblehead here on the screen. That's what it takes. And I think that's what a quality training camp as a master's competitor who is not a professional grappler, like that's kind of what it takes for me anyway. It's accepting the undulation. It's accepting that not everything is going to be consistent or perfect all the time. Just like my training session on Saturday, ideally I would have gone hard for 60 minutes, but there was a point of breakdown lurking and I decided to back away from it. So giving myself the permission and the freedom to accept that and to be okay with it is a challenge. Just like it's a challenge to accept all these other variables I just made. But I find that the more adept I get at accepting these things and embracing that imbalance, the more balanced I feel, which is perhaps not surprising. But anyway, this week, I thought I would do something different. I've kind of been sitting on this for a while. This is going to be sort of a mailbag episode. I received this note from a listener who also happens to be a student at the school. His name is Joe. I swear to God, I did not write this email to myself, but this is from a fellow named Joe who's a white belt at Princeton BJJ. And he writes, "Congratulations on earning your black belt." Thanks, Joe. I've listened to a couple of your meditations and their thoughtful pleasures. Thanks again. I wondered if you would be interested in meditating on a BJJ topic that may resonate with a lot of people. I grew up Catholic, but I haven't been to church in ages. And though I no longer believe in Catholicism, I miss being a part of a community. The secularization of the U.S. seems to encourage many people to find an alternative spiritual community in group athletic activities. Jessica Gross's excellent piece this morning had me thinking about this again. She writes about this phenomenon in terms of CrossFit and SoulCycle, but the parallels to BJJ are strong. I think you would enjoy her article too. I'll include the link to the article in the show notes. Anyway, I just wanted to congratulate you on your black belt and throw this idea out and see if you'd find it an exciting topic on which to meditate. See you at the gym. Best, Joe. And Joe, you wrote me that note on July 26th, and I've been kind of holding on to it just for this occasion because we've got some changes coming up, which I'll recap at the end of the episode. But anyway, yeah, I do have some thoughts on this. I have a lot of thoughts on this, many of which are borrowed from John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which I'll also link to in the show notes. If any of this kind of sparks something for you, I strongly suggest going and checking him out. But I think that the connection to jiu-jitsu is super apparent, and it's something that I've seen in a lot of people, and they might not even realize that that's what's bringing them into jiu-jitsu in the first place, or that's what's keeping them there. I believe Erica Zendel on our episode that we did together said something to the effect of, remember your why, or revisit your why for training jiu-jitsu, because the why that brought you in the door probably won't be the why that keeps you there. And I find that very often the why that keeps many students here is exactly the phenomenon that Joe is describing in this newsletter. And I think that John Vervaeke provides a good outline, a good structure or mental model for understanding that why a bit better. So I'll kind of give you the broad strokes. So I think to understand why, and let me preface all this by saying, like, I'm not a theologian. I'm not a historian. I have a bachelor's degree in journalism. Not particularly well educated beyond that. This is just a subject that I'm hugely curious about, and that I spent a lot of time thinking about in 2020 and 2021 during the pandemic, because it kind of turned into this fireball that you couldn't ignore. So I'm just a guy who has thought a lot about this stuff and has opinions about it, and feel free to take them seriously, but please, if you do take them seriously, hold them lightly, because I might change my mind about all of this tomorrow. Anyway, I think to kind of understand this phenomenon, we need to look at the evolution of religion and religious thought in the West. And I'm going to skip a lot of history because this is a 20-minute podcast. But I think it starts in my mind, this phenomenon that we see in Jiu Jitsu and these other domains, other sports, begins with Martin Luther in the 97 Thesis. And what Luther was describing in his 97 Thesis, or calling for, was sort of a direct relationship between you and God. You know, he was saying there was no longer any of this need for intermediaries between you and God, especially with the advent of the printing press and with the Bible being published in English, or his advocacy for the Bible being published, not in English, it wasn't English, but in whatever the common tongue was of that country. There was no reason to have these intermediaries, and it was time to reform, hence the Reformation, the sort of stranglehold that the Catholic Church had on at least Christianity. And, you know, there was a lot of positive stuff that came out of that. There was this more of a direct relationship between people and God. There was this more academic, sort of true academic spirit of thinking about these things and intellectualizing them on your own. That's kind of how I frame it, as like a permission for honest intellectual exploration of these ideas of faith. And that, of course, led to vast splintering of the Catholic Church and into Protestantism and all the modern sects that you see of the Protestant faith today. For context, I was raised Christian Reform and then Presbyterian, so like I've kind of been on the front lines of this struggle myself. The Irish side of my family is very Irish Catholic, yeah, I've kind of got like the Catholic soul with the Protestant brain, if that makes sense. So kind of how I frame this whole evolution of man having, and when I say man, I mean human, I don't mean men, man having more of a direct relationship with God. It's like disseminated sense making. For centuries, if you were a Christian, the Pope and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church were sort of your outsourced sense making on all things, really on all things, on science, on theology, on everything. You know, this was the filter through which all of your thoughts passed. Surely people thought outside of that filter, but this was the predominant trend. This was sort of like the prevailing wind of the time. So Luther comes along, his ideas take root, and then that sense making becomes disseminated. Flash forward a few centuries, and we have the death of God. I want to say that the death of God is a product of the Reformation indirectly, and it's also a product of what am I looking for here? What's the word I'm looking for here? Well, it's a product of the Enlightenment too, in a way. But I want to say it's more of, that's what I'm looking for. It's more of a product of like the rise of rationality of science. You know, we kind of default to this way of sense making now that is like very useful, in that we test things empirically and we look for empirical data. This is the scientific method in action, and it kind of is extremely useful in terms of developing modern technology, keeping people alive, curing diseases, all these things that we really value here in the West, right? But people have this deep spiritual longing, or a call. If it's not a spiritual longing, like, let me just say that I think that humans, all humans, whether they realize it or not, they have this deep spiritual longing inside of them. And one of the ways that longing for communion, like in the sense of Christian communion, but also in the sense of, co-union with other people, manifests as in religion. Like, this religion was sort of the hub of communities for centuries, and then all of a sudden, science and rationality kind of just like obliterates that, and in a lot of ways, like, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. There is no longer this thing that's higher than man and man's rationality, or there is, and it's kind of obscured by a different kind of dogma, a dogma of rationality. And again, I want to be too critical of rationality. Like, rationality is great, but I think we need all of these things. And it's kind of where I'm going with this exploration and this argument that I'm making here. So religion kind of subsides a bit and continues to subside into present day. And instead we get the rise of the state. The state becomes this God figure in most people's lives. And that's how you get all the atrocities of the 20th century, like the Holocaust, for example. We put too much faith in the state to solve our problems, to manage our problems, and you end up with a disaster on your hands, with like a true disaster measured in almost incalculable human toll, whether we're talking about the rise of fascism or the rise of communism. It's kind of undeniable that millions died because of both, and atrocities were committed because of both. Now, we fought a war to figure out that neither of those ideologies were all that good, and here we are today, and we are in this state, I think, that became the severity of which became impossible to ignore in 2020 and 2021, when social order and institutions began to falter, and we began to realize that things we could trust, we can no longer trust. Things that made sense so no longer made sense. And yeah, people have and continue to cope with that disintegration in real time in some interesting and surprising ways. But ultimately, at the root of that anxiety, that cultural anxiety that we have, is this need for a sense of belonging, a sense of communitas that Joe describes having experienced as a Catholic, as a younger person, and experiences in Jiu Jitsu now. And I think that's true. I think that is one of the whys that people stay in Jiu Jitsu for. Like, one of the things I realized right away during the pandemic when my school shut down was how Jiu Jitsu was my sole source of human interaction, really, outside of my interaction with my wife. My son wasn't born yet. I was self-employed and working remotely long before COVID was even a thing. And I've always kind of thought of myself as like a bit of a lone wolf, an outsider. And this pandemic comes along, and I said, no problem. Like, this is how I live my life anyway. I'll just won't have jujitsu from an indeterminate amount of time. That sounds terrible, but hopefully it won't be forever, right? And right away, it's not like I was losing my grasp on reality, or at least I don't think I was, but my sense of order that came from this embodied practice and the community of friends, people I love, that I had been connected to, sort of vanishing overnight. That really started to take a toll on me in a way that I had not anticipated. And it sort of underscored the importance of having something like this need for, let's call it like a spiritual connection. Let's call it like a soulful connection. And I think that a lot of people get that from CrossFit. A lot of people get that from, I don't know, I've never done Soul Cycles, so I can't really speak to that. But a lot of people get from it in these embodied practices, right? And then to kind of yank that out from underneath them, like, everybody kind of realized the value of it immediately. But I think so. That's the light side of it. I think it's also important to talk about the shadow side of it. Just like any other type of religion, there can be dogma associated with it. There can be abuse associated with it, and we see this in jiu-jitsu. We see unethical operators in this space who abuse their power, who abuse their reputation or their position within a school to like either directly or indirectly take advantage of people. And we've seen this pattern play out in organized religion too. Uh, it's important that we call in the rationality and the critical thinking of the Enlightenment to look at these things, lest jiu-jitsu become a cult of abuse, which it has become in some cases. I think on the whole, this is a beautiful art, but it has the potential for darkness, just like any other religion has the potential for darkness. So choose which communities within the sport that you want to belong to. Choose that very carefully, and kind of always have an eye open to the possibility that what you're seeing and what you're hearing may not actually be what's going on. I think that's a standard that we all need to hold ourselves to. But ultimately, the rise of these embodied practices, I think we can draw a through line from the 97 thesis to now, that people do have this natural spiritual longing, this natural feeling, this natural spiritual desire for connection with fellow humans and with something higher than themselves. And let's face it, if you are truly invested this in this beautiful art, like you're connected to something higher than yourself. I mean, there's a reason why you're listening to this that's more than jujitsu, because I'm not here to like talk about the nuts and bolts mechanics of the game. I'm talking about this higher thing. So if you're listening right now, like you get it. There's something more compelling in the room that's keeping you there. So let's kind of keep an eye on what that thing is. And also let's make sure it doesn't become something disastrous or calamitous. Let's make sure that it remains something beautiful, that it's an art form, and that we can all have this profound experience, transformative experience, without it becoming something cult-like and dangerous. So yeah, that's really all I got on that subject. It was a really great note, Joe. Thanks for sending that in. But yeah, just to wrap things up, I mentioned earlier at the top of this episode that we got some changes coming up. The first is on, I don't know if you guys ever follow on Instagram, but you can. We're bjj_meditations on Instagram. One of the things I've been doing for the essays and for the sort of show tiles that I post on Instagram promoting each episode is I really like experimenting with DALL-E, which is OpenAI's generative art platform, where you can feed it, you can tell it to create a piece of artwork given certain descriptors, and it will spit something out. And I love this idea of like having a conversation with the machine. I'm a huge Blade Runner fan, so I like to play in this murky water that our culture finds itself in with AI at the moment. So one of the early listeners to the show was this woman, Elizabeth Bass, who is Lisa K.A. Learns on Instagram. And she's sent me numerous thoughtful messages, and she asked me the other day, like, hey, who does your art? And I was like, well, funny story. A robot does it. And she volunteered to do the show tiles and the episode artwork for each of these episodes. So be on the lookout. Not this episode, but the next episode will have her first piece of artwork showcased. Really looking forward to collaborating with her. I enjoy so much collaborating with fellow creatives on all fronts. And this is just another amazing opportunity to see how this martial art informs the creative work of another brilliant artist. So be on the lookout for that. As always, if you want to support BJJ Meditations, there are two ways you can do it. The first is you can purchase an NFT of the essays on Mirror, or if you're not crypto savvy, the other way you can do it is to work with me. The way I kind of look at BJJ Meditations is that these episodes and all the information I'm putting out there, and I'm going to be putting out some more sort of organized information in the near future once I launch the website, which is very close to launching. all this stuff is free, and it's free because it's kind of esoteric. I can't really charge you money for it. But B, I think that creating that sense of communitas around these ideas is hugely important to me. And I kind of want BJJ Meditations to be the fire, the campfire, which we all gather around. So, if you want to financially support BJJ Meditations, it's not going to be in the form of like buying a subscription to it or anything. Like, the material is always going to be free. I think the best way to do it would be just to book a coaching session with me. And you can do that just by emailing me. The email's in the show notes. My methods are a combination of my own ideas and a combination of the things that I've learned working in the peak performance space with Emily Kwok and Josh Waitskin. And basically the coaching services that I provide, like I do private lessons in Jiu Jitsu, but I think that if you work with me, your Jiu Jitsu is going to get better. But really, I think where I'm different and where I can be of more service to people is in taking these ethereal thematic concepts and applying them to Jiu Jitsu and making your life better across multiple domains. That's certainly what's worked for me, and that's worked for the clients that I've worked with. And that's what I'd like to do with you. If you're interested in supporting me or the podcast, that's the best way to do it. And then the final thing you can do to support the podcast is to just like, subscribe, and review and share it. I saw we got a couple more reviews on Spotify, which is hugely helpful. Thanks, guys. That gets the podcast in front of more people. And wherever you're watching or listening, just do the same thing, and that would be fantastic. If you're interested in any more of my ideas, you can follow me on Substack, johannan.substack.com, also in the show notes. And then finally, you can come and train at Princeton Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'd love to meet you. If any international folks find yourself in the States, please drop in. Newark Airport is about an hour away from where we are, and we're in Princeton, which is, the home of Princeton University. Great place to go and visit, and we're about an hour and 10 minutes by train to New York City. So we're kind of, New Jersey is the armpit of the U.S., but the beauty of being an armpit is you're centrally located to the rest of the body. So keep that in mind if you ever decide to come here. Anyway, this has been a bit of a longer episode. Well, actually not. It's kind of crazy how I usually manage to land these things right on time, actually. Anyway, we're around the 28-minute mark, so that's all I've got for this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk next week.